the role really morphs from being a collector to being someone who can sustain the plants that really is a custodian. So custodial, almost responsibilities to preserve, protect, and defend nature is part of what all collectors should and can evolve to.
Dear plant lovers, I'm thrilled to present the magnificent garden of Dr. Jeff Block in Miami, Florida. Many of us, myself included, know Dr. Block as a world-renowned Anthurium hybridizer. I was fascinated to discover that Anthuriums are just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to his vast expertise and deep passion for the botanical world. In this episode, we take a tour of Dr. Block's garden, a labor of love that took decades to cultivate, and meet some of the extraordinary plants that call it home. Throughout the tour, he generously shares invaluable plant care tips, proudly showcasing some marvelous specimens, and concludes with a thoughtful philosophy on plant collecting. We then dive into an interview where Dr. Block offers his insight on the controversial marijuana plant and the role of irrigation in plants. If you're eager to learn more about Dr. Block's Anthuriums, stay tuned for the next episode, which will be dedicated entirely to this spectacular genus.
This is an outside area under the canopy of a live oak. And oak hammocks in the Florida Everglades ecosystem are growing on slightly higher ground. Why is that important? Because in the summer, the rest of the area that's not quite this high will seasonally have high water and be floods. It'll be underwater, but not so here. So this is a sweet spot, so to speak. I'm not on the coast, but just 3 miles or 5 kilometers inland. The property here was used for agriculture over 100 years ago. It was an avocado and mango grove. But I found that the natural resources and the environment, the soils under the canopy of these ancient oak trees, creates an environment which are suitable for many other tropical ornamentals, including bromeliads, which is a plant group I started with, orchids, ferns, certainly aroids that people are aware of, but even things that can grow suspended up in the air, such as Platycerium, ferns. And there's a beautiful example of one not native to here, but native to the Philippines, and that's Platycerium coronarium, which makes quite a statement. And when it's growing like this here outside under the protection and safe canopy of an oak, it's the perfect environment. The oak trees are also very strong. It's been available, in different plant shows and sales for decades. But growing it and sustaining it and getting it to be a specimen is something different. It's almost always sold only initially as a single little offshoot, but they don't divide very readily. They don't spread as quickly as you would think because they actually have what's called a stolon that underneath only once in a while can extend out. Why is that important? Because I started with one little plant and I put it on the side of a palm tree. Now, palm trees narrow. So the big leaves that you see now, yes, they go up and down, but it was one side of the palm tree. But over many years, those little stolons wrapped around, and now I had the namesake for why it's called Platycerium coronarium. It means crown. If you can see those top fronds, those are forming the whole crown all the way around. And that's why the plant has that name. Unfortunately, it gets big. And the palm tree that it was on, it was a little more than it could take, so it started to bend. And no longer was it presented as nice and vertically as gravity would call for. So instead, when the palm tree was coming down, before it crashed, I cut the bottom out and just used chains to put this and suspend it from a higher branch in this oak tree, because the oak trees are incredibly strong. They can support this kind of weight.
And do you know how many years it takes to grow from a little plant to something this big?
I would guess that is no less than 20 years from the original plant, but possibly as much as 30 years.
Now, have you had this produce stowaways around the garden? Because they tend to spread spores by wind.
Not this one yet. I kind of wished it would because it's such a stately example, but there are plenty of examples of other staghorns that have volunteered, as you're saying, because we keep the environment moist. There's misting of reverse osmosis, pure water, so that when the rainy season is not here, we have rain here for 5 months out of the year, from essentially the beginning of June through the end of October. But the other 7 months are relatively dry, and too dry for plants that are used to being sustained year-round with high-quality water. So we substitute the high quality water with the emphasis on quality by not using regular groundwater that can have other solutes and not our municipal water that's great for our health, but not as good for plant health. We do it with something that equates what rainwater would be in terms of its chemistry and cleanliness. And that's an essential message here, because as a physician, I can tell you that if I want to make you healthy, I'd make sure you only drink clean water. If I want to get the Nobel Prize in medicine, it would be for finding a way that all of the Earth's inhabitants could only have clean water, and I'd cure more diseases than plagues like COVID ever thought of hurting. So clean water is my highest standard that I can apply to plants, and it's rule number one for cleanliness. Whenever given the opportunity, use clean water on your plants. They'll like you for it.
Awesome. And you shared with me earlier about the pH value of the plant. What is an ideal pH value for plants?
Well, let's make sure everybody knows what pH, small p, capital H, it's a measurement for how acidic or alkaline. This is ways that we look at different chemicals. Things that are acid generally are referred to as having a pH number that is lower than 7. Things that are alkaline, otherwise known as basic, are things that have a pH that is higher than 7. And most rain is fairly neutral at around 7. You and I, in our blood, we live at a pH of 7.4. And by the way, the reason I specified 0.4 is because this is what's called a logarithmic scale. That's a geeky point again, meaning it's many times more. It's not just an integral number. And plants, on the other hand, really need what they have and flourish best at a pH of around 6. Which again, pH scale is many times more acidic than a human needs. It's not highly acidic, that could be corrosive. And it's not highly alkaline, that could be also corrosive. Humans like us, we would feel sick if our pH was not 7.4, but a little higher, 7.6 or down to 7.2. We would be sick and seeking help in an emergency room. We would feel that bad. But plants can be more tolerant. However, they do really prefer that pH of 6 because, here's the reason. Research done shortly after World War II revealed that plants are best able to absorb their full nutrients, not only the principal nutrients, but what are called minor nutrients, at a pH of close to 6, not the 7.4 that we animals live at. And that's a very important distinction. So it's not just high quality water, but of the right chemical consistency. Even though it's pure, that pH is still something that gets measured and compared to God's natural rains. Most municipal water that you get from a municipal source right out of the kitchen tap, is generally going to be a little on the alkaline side. The reason why is kind of interesting, because alkaline water to our taste tastes a little sweet. It tends to be perceived as a sweet taste, while acidic water tends to be sour. So for flavor purposes, a little alkalinity helps. People say that it may also make a difference because of the pH that I said us as animals are. But for the most part, water that is sweeter tasting is more popular. And here's a little point about where we're standing today. Miami, Florida. I want to tell you the meanings of both of those names, the name of the city and the state. Miami is actually an ancient word from indigenous people who knew that the water here was sweet. The name Miami means sweet water. And the name Florida, which was written on the old Spanish maps when the New World was being discovered, was actually the entire southeast of the United States. But this particular state, located in the extreme southeast, and here in southeast Florida, we're in the extreme, was known to be Terra Florida, land of flowers. So when we're talking about Miami sweet water in the state that is named because of how many flowers do well here, that gives you an idea for why I've lived here for almost all of my adult life.
That's amazing.
Some projects don't happen overnight. This is a plant that moved here with me from my previous residence, but in 1989. And some of you may know it as a ponytail palm. It's actually not a palm at all. It's more of a succulent. And what I wanted to share with you is the tendency for how these grow is not at all symmetrical with branches like this. It tends to be very free-formed however it wants to look. But for this plant, when I moved here back then, there was only one stalk in it. The plant was much smaller in a small terracotta pot, but that one stalk would not fit in the moving truck, so I had to cut it away. And after I realized that it was putting out multiple heads, I selected 5 from different locations because I wanted to develop this to look like a hand.
Nice.
Okay, 5 fingers. And I took pictures of my kids growing up, sitting up in here and straddling them. A decade later, I had 5 big stalks. I cut it again. And then I waited again and then selected out, after I made the cut, of 5 more heads. So there's 5 times 5. And the most recent cut recently now has this canopy on top, which is really the growth that you would normally see, but with a nice full symmetrical canopy over a plant that otherwise would be horribly asymmetrical. But this takes intentional sculpting on a timeline, and the timeline here alone is 35 years. We had a big hurricane here in 1992 called Hurricane Andrew. And I had many fruit trees because this used to be, as I mentioned, an avocado and mango grove. But when they were gone from the storm, I replanted using something far more aerodynamic, palms. And so there's a nice palm collection here. And I want to point out a few quick things. This palm obviously is what's called a clumping palm, not an individual single one. So some of the palms we grow are by design clumpers. And the leaves on palms are different too, from different types. These are pinnate leaves, a central spine, and then leaflets coming off in either direction. You can compare that leaf to, say, the one over here, if you want to just share. Okay, so that's a palmate leaf, and it's called palmate because the structure does not have a central line, but it's more like the palm of your hand. And so you can see then that the shapes of these two are very different. If you even go look straight up from where we are now, just turn around and go straight up. There you'll see, pan from there to your left, and that's a palmate leaf, and here's a coconut palm with coconuts on it as a pinnate leaf. Palms also can have a high ornamental value, especially when they're red like this. This is a palm called Certostachys renda, otherwise known as a lipstick palm. And its red color is coveted by collectors. However, it's highly cold sensitive. So you won't be finding many of these in the US, at least outside of South Florida. So palms can be ornamental, not only red. This is a white elephant palm. Why is it called that by nickname? Its actual full name is Caryodoxa elegans, but the black here belies the white elephant name. And the reason it's called a white elephant is because the backside of the leaf is actually white and frosted. So in the evening, if the light hits this, it looks like it's on fire. So palms can also be hosts for plants, including epiphytes. Here's a airita shingle plant. And a beautiful thing, the way it layers out like that, but they can also host orchids and Platycerium or staghorn ferns, and even bromeliads, because there's something to grab. So down here, these are other palms where another feature might be what's on the outside of that palm. This is popularly known as an old man palm. The hair here, if you're asking me, it's a bleach blonde at the beach after a full day there, and it's quite beautiful. The hair persists for a while, and this is just part of the nature of this. And as supporting other types of vining plants.
Beautiful.
Okay, so this, again, is one look for the way that trunks can hold instead of like this. This whole skirt are leaves from decades ago that are still retained as the palm goes up. So as you look up at this palm, you start to see so many years represented, not by seeing the trunk even, but by seeing all the old leaf bases. Now, you want to know how dry it can stay? Look at the umbrella underneath when you move underneath. Look at that. Ah, now you see it. Can you see how that would be intended by nature to keep everything at the base very dry?
Interesting.
It's got an umbrella built into it.
Yeah, so it's like the water's just going to trickle off to
Yeah, it has a built-in umbrella.
There's all these cane Diphyllodokias are grown along the ground, and I know that they can propagate sideways like that. Does that happen?
Oh yeah, yeah. Or if I were to go down and make cut, they'd all start suckering.
Turn into different plants. That's interesting. It's how I propagate them, but it's interesting to see them creep like this in nature.
So this is known as a cannonball tree because of its namesake fruit. And they get pretty heavy. It looks a lot like the size, and actually the weight And when these drop down, you don't want them to fall on your head. But the flowers that yield these come actually from flowering, not roots, but they're actually flowering structures off of the trunk itself. And the flowers are beautiful. They're almost look like a sea anemone, where you'd expect a clownfish to come from swimming out from it. But this tree is still fairly unusual here, especially in the United States. I believe it comes naturally from India, and so do the mango trees on this property. And so mangoes then are the next neighboring tree that we have right over here, if you want to take a little look there. That mango tree is the national champion mango tree for the United States, which is designating those trees which are the largest known of their kind. And this is the United States champion tree for mangoes. It's not just the height and the circumference of the canopy, but it's actually the circumference of the trunk, 4.5 feet off the ground. That is the measured highest ranked variable in how they determine when something's a champion tree. So I don't make the rules or the measurements. I was just told this is the largest mango on record in the US.
Nice. And a quick question. How old is this, do you know?
Yes, it would have been planted when this grove started in 1916, which makes it 108 years old.
Oh my gosh, that's over a human lifetime.
Oh yeah.
Does it produce a lot of mangoes for you?
Yes, but they're so high up when they fall off and they hit the ground, they don't look too good anymore. Anyway, I've just pulled this out of the ground. These are the rhizomes of Dahlia ferns, otherwise known as rabbit's foot ferns. Sometimes they're fuzzy, which like a rabbit's foot is. But here's the point. These are actually much more durable. They can snap, but trying to break it this way is nearly impossible. And so I use it as a ground cover, partly because it ties together all of the soil. So because I have palm trees, yes, they're aerodynamic, but there's still stress points where it's rooted in the ground. So you can't see it, but throughout this entire area, these Dahlia ferns, stolons, they're called, those lines, are all making a meshwork that I think holds the plants down. And so you don't have to weight them with wood supports or things like that. This is naturalizing it for a function that probably these trees where they naturally come from wouldn't think of using. But it kind of makes for a nice balance too, as far as landscape design, because it gives me a relatively higher understory to showcase palms and cycads, which, as I said, seem to fare far better in a storm than does the branching trees.
That's cool. So a clump like this, when you got this, it was maybe like a few small plants that it just started to spread.
Exponentially, because that's what plants can be trained to do. That's what tissue culture expects.
Nice. Do you happen to know, are these epiphytic in nature? Or
They're not truly epiphytic in that they start on the ground. They won't necessarily take by a spore going to a tree. But in terms of their tendency, they have tendencies to climb. So you give them something like this, and I really do have to keep pulling things off because they'll get up here and then I'll have to say, how much do I want to see of the tree versus the fern? Is there a tendency to climb? There you go.
Yeah. So that sticks and it just creeps up.
Mm-hmm. Sure. But they're responding to a little bit of the humidity and everything that stays here because the trunk of the tree gets exposed to the humidity just like a cloud forest, trickles down, the ferns sense it, and they thrive where everything stays consistent year in, year out. This palm, Corypha, is the genus, but it's called a talipot palm. It comes from the other side of the world. And this palm is the largest of all the palm species. The individual fan-shaped leaves that it has can be up to 16 feet across, well over 20 meters. So, or around 20. This palm then, I just wanted to show you in scale and size, is not something you would put right next to your front door. It would make your house look too small and would probably lose its value. But for an ornamental piece, this is a very special palm. Only flowers once and then it dies, but not before putting out a flower spike that is the size of a small tree that can hold up to 1 million seeds. And that's the life cycle of this. Hopefully that doesn't happen because there's a lot of waste to take away. But as long as it looks like this and I have it in a situated place in the garden where it's not overcrowding things, here it is in all of its magnificence. This was planted in 1991 from a single leaf. All right, so this is a good area that shows things that I had collected decades ago. And yes, I started with epiphytes, air plants, orchids, bromeliads, certainly ferns. That's when I was a collector. And in those days, I really wanted one of everything. Most collectors do. And when you're young and enthusiastic like that, constraint is really important, because it doesn't matter if you live in a one-bedroom apartment or you have a 100-acre ranch. If you have that collector's hoarding mentality, you're going to run out of space faster than you think. So I've had to generate a different sensibility about the plants that I may own, such that I'm more concerned with sustaining them. As a collector, if you have plants that you kill, think of it as your investment, because you did pay for that plant in all likelihood, or even if you traded with somebody for something special, if you kill it, it's gone. 100% of your time and energy and investment is lost. And how many investments would you wait for 100% to disappear? So the role really morphs from being a collector to being someone who can sustain the plants that really is a custodian. So custodial almost responsibilities to preserve, protect, and defend nature is part of what all collectors should and can evolve to. It may take a while getting out of your collector's creative habits, but sooner or later you'll realize that if you can sustain those plants, not for yourself, but for the people who follow you, you will have done something noble. Okay, so let's get a little geeky for just a moment. It won't take much time, but I think a great place to start is to understand that there are 3 kingdoms of living things. Animals, includes us. Plants, everything you see around you is a second one. That the third kingdom is actually fungi, which is mushrooms and things like that. 3 distinct life forms, and yet if you look at the biochemistry, the molecules that actually feed one animal, plant, or even fungi, the interesting thing is they're remarkably similar. And you and I, as animals, are closer related. You think the plants, because that's where most of the modern medicines come from, but we're actually closer biochemically related to fungi. So there's a whole world of future research involving this. And actually, the Chinese knew for thousands of years about how to process certain plant-based chemicals better than Western culture people ever could. So the biochemistry that's supporting all this makes perfect sense, not just to me, but hopefully to you now in context. So I'm actually also a medical doctor. I'm not just called DocBlock for no reason. I'm actually a physician, an MD, medical doctor. I have formal training in chemistry from Emory University, which is in Atlanta, Georgia, followed by medical school at the University of Miami, and then became an anesthesiologist, board-certified anesthesiologist. I have a subspecialty training fellowship in pain management, and that's probably another contributing reason why I enjoy being outdoors so much. Gardening is a hobby, even for people with life-threatening and painful illnesses. It sort of helps pass the time. It doesn't take that much thought, but integrating with nature is healthy in many respects, including when you're sick. So rest is very important, but quality of life to preserve health and wellness counts for something too. And I think in this environment, I'm blessed to have a high quality of life. I practiced clinical medicine as a hospital-based anesthesiologist for close to 25 years. I still have affiliations with academia, where I'm a adjunct professor at the University of Miami, Miller School of Medicine. And in that capacity, I've also served as the president of the Medical School's Alumni Association, which I graduated from but over 40 years ago. So I brought 40 years of medical training, hobbyist initially for plants, but now I have the time and fortunately the resources to focus my future on working with plants, but from that same perspective of health and wellness.
With so many beautiful ornamental plants that you grow here, is there something else that you would like to grow?
You know, I have been blessed to find many different resources for bringing plants from around the world here. But there's one plant you won't find here because it's actually illegal. And I, as an academician, as an expert with not just ornamental plants, but with botanical medicines, I actually have an interest to work with certain plants that many humans are consuming globally, and that's cannabis. Florida, the state that I live in, now has medical source and resource cannabis legal, and many states in the United States and even our federal government is about to change how the plant is actually classified from being prohibited to being a controlled substance, meaning a physician and patient can discuss how to use what plant-based chemicals come from cannabis, otherwise known in our laws as marijuana, in order to help health and wellness. Now, does that mean it's good for everything that hurts? No. But to understand that the modern plant, unfortunately, has been hybridized probably over the last 50 years that it's been under federal prohibition by the United States government, into something actually quite unnatural, because the component of the psychoactive THC, actually called delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, there's a geeky term, that chemical in a plant, when I was a kid growing up in 1970, was only about 3 or 4% of the total dry weight of the flowers of these plants. Nowadays, when you go to the dispensaries, they're called, where people can legally access it, you'll find different cultivars of that now that are actually up to 25%. Now that's quite remarkable horticulturally, because that's the weight of a single, what's called secondary metabolite, and to have 25% of the chemicals produced being that which is psychoactive is purely a man-made exploitation, in a sense, of the plant. People were interested in the plant because of those chemicals in it that would get people high and they could feel something in their mind. But there are many, not only cannabinoids in the plant, the general word for it, but other chemicals called terpenes, things that give all plants their smells. Those balances of chemicals that likely existed for 6,000 years of documented evidence that started in China over 6,000 years ago off the slopes of the eastern slopes of the Himalayas, would have been cultivars that humans evolved with and bred and used those particular varieties of the plant that were healthy for them. If it really was unhealthy, either the people or the plants would have become extinct by now, but that hasn't happened. And in fact, humans have been the vector that have brought cannabis all the way around the world. It's not the seeds floating or an animal eating the seeds and defecating a seed someplace else where it was eaten, or it's not like a fern where a spore brings the plant from place to place. It's human beings that during the last 6,000 years has brought that particular plant around the world. In the last 50 years in particular, I don't think it's continued to evolve. It probably has devolved into something quite unnatural that is no longer balanced in a way that I think that humans evolved and used therapeutically for thousands of years. Yeah. So that's a plant I'd like to be able to work with, which may happen legally in Florida as new licenses that are legally able to have companies grow it. In my state of Florida, fortunately, the law says that an employee has to include a Florida licensed physician. That is what I am. And so that way I could actually work with a botanical medicine and considerably differently hybridize it, hopefully to restore it almost like an heirloom plant might be considered when you want to restore something to the way it used to be. That to me would be an exciting next project to work on. Variegated aroids, for instance, is all the rage. Everybody loves variegated plants and they seemingly have that much more value to collectors. But here's what you need to know also about some variegation in plants. Sometimes the variegation is caused from viruses that the plants can encounter. In particular, one called a mosaic virus. And if you speak to any accomplished and well-intended grower of cannabis, you'll find out that tobacco mosaic virus is an incurable virus when it gets into cannabis crops. So people who are growing responsible cannabis, especially of a purity and quality for medicinal purposes, would never allow someone to smoke a tobacco cigarette inside a cannabis grow, because the virus is actually released in the fumes. And so there, the virus may not cause variegation in the cannabis, but it certainly is something where mosaic viruses are famous for causing genetic problems in plants, including cannabis. And a mosaic virus actually was also historically associated with tulips. The Dutch tulip craze from hundreds of years ago, where tulips were developed that were black leaves. The most precious of all those tulips were tulips that had not only black leaves, but little fine white lines running through those leaves. That black and white tulip that's well pictured in art because it long predates photography was really worth many years' salaries for few people. It was that coveted and rare. And the Dutch in those days, a few hundred years ago, had a lot of wealth from the discovery of the New World. So there were collectors even back then. And it was, like variegated plants are today in aeroids, a huge inflated bubble of value that when that bubble collapsed for the Dutch, the value of the people holding these precious bulbs plummeted, and many people were left holding things that are worthless. So the caveat, the message here is beware of how much you invest at any given time. Make sure you invest in things that are healthy as far as plants. And also for that reason about the comments on variegation in cannabis, please know that many viruses manifest themselves through variegation and show up as variegation, and that the white or the non-green part of a variegated leaf really does not have its full complement of chloroplasts, those same cells that let the plant get the sunlight in to get its energy. We talked about that earlier. And yet those plants, if anybody's grown enough variegated plants, usually as the plant leaf declines, you'll see that decline in the leaf with decomposing leaf matter on the white or the non-colored part because of its loss of having not as many chloroplasts. So these are subtle reasons why variegation in plants can be quite beautiful, but it's also something to watch for when it may not be for the benefit of the healthiest plant you could get. Okay.
All right.
So our mics are on. We're ready.
I think, yeah.
Yeah. So Sean, have a drink of water. I'll tell you why. I want you to make sure there's no flavors or anything left in your mouth, because now I get to show you some things about miracle fruit.
Okay.
And I'm telling it to you about how it works and what it does as an anesthesiologist, medical doctor, and plant person. Anesthesiologists are experts with receptors. These are the things in our body that allow us to perceive things biochemically. And your taste are done with receptors, taste buds. And generally it's thought that people have 4 principal taste buds. Actually, people from Asia sometimes have a 5th. That's why, certain flavors, MSG, for instance, is perceived only with some people, but predominantly all people on Earth, sweet, sour, bitter, and salt are the 4 principal flavors.
Sure.
There's a lemon there.
Okay.
And that lemon, you want to tell everybody if it's a real lemon or not? Take a taste.
Like this?
Yeah. Oh, you see that face you made? That's because there's sour.
Yeah.
But what you can't perceive because of how sour it is that there's actually a lot of sugar and sweetness in there.
In this?
In that, but it's being overwhelmed by the sour. These are miracle fruit. This comes from a bush that grows in West Africa. And it's a very slow growing bush, needs an acid environment to grow well. But it's very sweet. There's a seed inside. So why don't you take 2 of these, put them in your mouth. Go ahead. They're very safe.
Do I take out the seeds or do I?
No, just go ahead and pop them in your mouth. And then you don't have to chew on the seed, but break the fruit off. And you'll see they taste very sweet. Take 2 in, because you're going to leave those in your mouth for about 1 minute.
The seed as well?
Yeah. You don't have to chew the seed, but just work the seed and the fruit
And that's all
around your tongue. No, just keep it in your mouth. And I'd like you to work the seed and the fruit in the backs and the sides of your tongue. That's actually where most of your taste buds are. Back sides of your tongue is where most of your taste buds are located.
I did not know that.
Yeah, that's where they are. But what's happening now is the miracle is that this, you can think of almost selectively blocking the sour. So what you're perceiving is the remaining sweet. They're actually very sweet, aren't they? What do they take? Aren't they nice?
It tastes like passion fruit at first, and then it tastes a little bit sweeter as time progresses.
Well, there used to be a candy when I was growing up as a kid, a little sugar wafer called Sweet Tarts. And that's, to me, is what it tastes like. So you got about another 10, 15 seconds. And then what we're going to do is I'm going to have you take out the seeds. And then I'm going to have you taste your lemon again.
Okay.
And when you taste the lemon again, don't look at me,
Okay.
but you're going to look at the camera. And watch what happens to his face when he perceives the sweet. Are you ready? Let's take him out.
Where's the...
Go ahead.
Okay.
Now try your lemon again.
It's good.
Different?
This is really good. Yeah.
You didn't bite into it and make a face this time.
Yeah.
Remember what you did when you took a little nibble before you went
Yeah.
like that?
Yeah, but this
How
is
does
good.
it taste now?
Actually like a lemon drop candy.
Yes. Have you ever heard an expression, if you have lemons, make lemonade?
Yeah.
This is how you do it.
Awesome. This is amazing. But ethnobotanically, is there any uses for this plant?
Yes. Well, first of all, if you were to freeze it, its activity is lost. So the active chemical in that, some people name it miraculin, but in the meantime, that chemical conceivably, and I've helped a few friends who have had cancers in their head and neck where they get radiation treatment, and you have a nerve in your area here that's called your ciliary nerve, and it makes it hard to smell. Smells and flavors are connected, and even I had a few friends during COVID that lost their sense of taste. As their taste started to come back and everything just tastes totally bland. One of the first things they were able to smile after they tried was when I gave them something like this, and suddenly they perceived sweet.
Ah, I see.
So this wouldn't be as fun if it only preserved bitter, would it?
Yeah.
No, but sweet is wonderful. We all react that way.
Yeah.
And this is a fruit that is sort of fooling your receptors for only about half an hour.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't want to have a nice, fancy, complex meal after this because the food wouldn't taste right. But for something like a lemon, a lime, other fruits, it makes, a stout beer taste like hot chocolate.
Yeah, it complements it very well, actually.
Take another bite. If you really did like it,
Yeah, I did like it.
You're never going to have a chance to bite into real lemons like that and eat it as vigorously as you're doing now.
Very, very delectable. Unforgettable. This is a good taste.
Unforgettable. Then it was worth our visit.
Yes. Thank you.
Pleasure meeting you, Sean.
Thank you. Pleasure meeting you too.